Welcome to Climate Now, a podcast that explores and explains the ideas, technologies, and the solutions that we'll need to address the climate crisis and achieve a zero-emissions future. I'm James Lawler, and if you like this episode, leave us a review, share it with your friends, or tell us what you think at contact@climatenow.com. For today's episode, cities across the United States and the world are trying to, quote, go green. But what does that really mean? And where do you start? With the cement and the rebar in the buildings? With the air conditioning and the heating systems? With fertilizer for parks and gardens? What about the carbon footprint of cranes and bulldozers? Or what about disadvantaged communities that live within city borders? How do you measure and quantify all of those things? And how should cities prioritize one initiative over another in the real world with limited resources? In this episode, we'll hear from two people making the somewhat nebulous concept of a green city a concrete reality. One is Tommy Linstroth of Green Badger, which is a company that helps planners and builders meet sustainability standards, specifically standards set by the United States Green Building Council, which Tommy calls in our interview the Green IRS. Next, we'll hear from an agent of that Green IRS, Hilari Varnadore, who manages large-scale programs for the U.S. Green Building Council. She'll explain how entire cities are working to reduce their impact on the planet and the people who live here. But first, our news segment, This Week in Climate News. Welcome to This Week in Climate News. And again, I have the pleasure of being joined by our co-host, Julio Friedman. Julio, welcome.
It is always a pleasure. Thank you, James.
I'd like to start off with this headline from the Financial Times. 1 in 5 cars sold in 2023 will be electric. That is this year. Did anyone predict this like 3 years ago, that 20% of new sales would be electric by 2023? Was anyone saying that in 2020? Or like this just seems incredible.
There were certainly groups who said this was possible, and a number of things have changed to make this the case. The most important of these is that the cost of batteries have dropped a lot, and the manufacturing capacity for batteries has grown a lot. These make it much more reasonable. Also, a number of automobile manufacturers, whether it's Volkswagen or, General Motors or Ford, are pushing hard into the electric vehicle space, and that building capacity helps. The build-out of infrastructure has mattered. If people know that they can charge their cars, that makes it easier for them to buy EVs. It doesn't change one important aspect of things, which is this is the flow of new vehicles into the market. It is not the stock of existing vehicles. The existing fleet will still be around for a long time, and as a consequence, we will still be using oil for a long time. But this definitely is much faster than many people expected or predicted, and that's really good news.
Now, the agency, the IEA, now expects 60% of sales in China, the US, and Europe to be fully electric by 2030. So just remember that for the next 7 years and see if they're right or wrong.
The one that's going to be easiest for that is China. China will almost certainly hit that kind of a target.
Yeah. Moving on, we have a story from April 25th in the New York Times that the EU is imposing a charge on some high emissions imports like steel. What does this mean for the EU? What does this mean for the rest of the steel producing and cement producing world that these border adjustments will be made on goods coming into the EU?
So the EU has been clear that they were going to do this for a long time. The fact that they have proposed rules is noteworthy because they've just done it. And this looks like more or less what they said they were going to do. This is a fairly straightforward idea, which is you figure out the life cycle footprint for a good, and based on that, if it's low enough, then it is imported without additional tariff. If it is not low enough, then there is an additional tariff. In part, this is a rejoinder to the Inflation Reduction Act. This is in part an attempt to help shore up European industries who will be able to make these clean goods this way. It is also rather deliberately an attempt to box out dirty products from Russia or from China or from places that do not make clean production wherever they are, and in doing so, reduce demand for the dirtier materials. So it's a well thought out strategy. The devil really is in the details. How these things get implemented is notoriously difficult. It is also the case that already a lot of European companies are complaining about how much this will ramp up their costs. In Europe, these costs are going to be high. Even though you get domestic production and security production, which is welcome, it in some cases will increase the cost of goods 30 or 40%.
There's another criticism that comes from, less developed countries that are saying that countries that have contributed the least to climate change, which is countries where a lot of manufacturing happens today, shouldn't have to pay as much as the industrial countries that caused the problem in the first place.
Correct. A lot of developing countries plan to grow their economies through industrialization. And if in fact they cannot sell their industrial products to a European market, they are worried about their ability to grow and develop.
And another story, which appeared in the Financial Times this week, is about, and I quote, a rising tide of investors backing demands for climate change plans from large financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America this week, as pressure against those institutions is rising over the role that they play in financing global warming through their lending operations. Julio, maybe you could shed some light on this. What exactly are these climate change plans? Why did the boards of these financial institutions recommend that investors vote against them in the first place? And what do you think this signals?
So I want to be clear about a couple of things. First of all, these companies, in particular these three banks, Goldman, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, are in fact developing plans for climate transition. They are definitely doing that work. They know that this is an important aspect of future investment readiness and health. That said, no board likes to be told what to do and when to do it, so they genuinely fight these kinds of things, even if they're doing it themselves, because they do not want to be beholden to others for a timetable or a specific target. That said, the shareholders didn't agree. An awful lot of shareholders, in the case of Wells Fargo, 30%, voted in favor of this mandate. That is not enough, but if you are in a board position and you see 30% of your shareholders saying that they want something, that has their attention. For sure, these banks are going to be taking the seriousness of planning and getting organized around climate much more seriously.
So, next story, Chile is taking a majority stake. So the government of Chile is taking a majority stake in lithium production in that country. This is a story from Bloomberg.
Right. So this is interesting and something we've seen before in Latin America. If a particular industry becomes big and lucrative, then the government wants to manage it. This is what happens in many nations, in many industries. This is noteworthy, though, because Chile produces so much lithium. So it's going to affect the energy transition. There's a question mark out there as to whether or not Chile will manage these companies well and manage the production of lithium well.
Yeah. I like this quote. "Money is a coward," Canadian mining billionaire Robert Friedland said this week, predicting that Chile's new framework will deter further investment in lithium production in the country. Quote, "It runs away at the first sign of trouble." So, words of warning there. Moving on. Occidental's new direct air capture plant was also in the news this week, and I believe Julio was actually on site for the ribbon cutting. This plant is designed to capture 500,000 tons of CO2 per year. What was that like, Julio?
So to be clear, this was the groundbreaking ceremony for this plant. They actually broke ground a few months ago, but it is a big honking deal. These people are going to build a massive industrial facility to pull CO2 out of the sky. It is roughly 100 times bigger than the other plants that are out there. So the Orca plant in Iceland is 4,000. This is 500,000. It's a lot bigger. It's a different process. It's a new technology. This is from Carbon Engineering. It's a solvent-based process. And they also announced offtakes, commercial offtakes from the Next Era facility. They already have offtakes from Airbus and from SK. And they unveiled the name. The name of the project is Stratos. And Oxy is the first company to make a net zero commitment for Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3. They were the first company to have a low-carbon business unit, the Low Carbon Ventures. They move most of the CO2 in the world. They do half of the enhanced oil recovery in the world. They do the overwhelming majority of carbon movement. So there's lots of reasons to think that this is going to get built and built on time.
Besides offtake agreements with some of the companies you mentioned, are they planning to do any on-prem storage of the CO2 that they capture
So
underground?
yes, Occidental Petroleum owns the pore volume injection rights. They're going to do the injection themselves. And it's worth knowing for Occidental, this plant will be a combination of both pure play storage and enhanced oil recovery. And that's because the customers have already asked for both. Airbus has asked for pure play storage, SK has asked for EOR.
Now on to our interview. It's Tommy Linstroth's job to help architects and builders make new structures more sustainable. His company, Green Badger, has developed a software platform to determine the specific materials, the equipment, the supply chains, the building plans, and dozens of other factors that will allow new buildings to meet sustainability and environmental, social, and governance standards. They can help building developers make choices from the brand of glass to use in the windows to picking subcontractors with strong ESG rankings. Here's Tommy.
We're really working to be a one-stop shop for anything that the construction industry runs into from a sustainability perspective. So we work with the construction industry to help them navigate how do you build and verify a green construction project over months or sometimes years or even decades of construction to track, to verify products, to help suggest products that are green, to manage and reduce waste, and then to track broader ESG metrics or environmental, social, governance metrics.
All right, so maybe you could explain what green construction means. So is this a well-defined concept at this point?
Sure. So historically, green is in the eye of the beholder, right? And a developer could put in one energy efficient light bulb and say, hey, I've designed and built a green building. So to counteract those claims, there's a number of third-party rating systems that have evolved over the past 20 years to really help, as you said, codify it, to standardize it, to make it measurable, and to make it definable.
The rating system that Green Badger uses is called Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED, launched by the United States Green Building Council in the late 1990s. LEED is a point-based system. Its lowest rank is certified, followed by silver, gold, and platinum. LEED uses criteria such as energy efficiency, carbon footprint, water use, the sustainability of building materials, and many other factors depending on what's being ranked. Homes, buildings, neighborhoods, and even entire cities can earn a LEED certification.
It's really been the gold standard for third-party building certification over the past 20 years. It's required for almost every federally funded project. It's used as the basis of design for 2/3 of state-funded projects. And you've got thousands of municipalities and institutions of higher education that have just said, of all of the third-party rating systems, this is the one we are going to hold ourselves accountable to.
Now, break down the criteria a little bit for us. So what are the different components of achieving a strong LEEDs rating, and what is a strong LEEDs rating?
It's a point-based rating system. So buildings in an urban core are going to perform different than, a suburban or a rural building. Buildings that are 2 stories and have lots of roof space for solar are going to perform different than a skyscraper that solar or renewables is much more difficult. So it's set up to be a flexible framework so that you can get rewarded for strategies that make sense for your project, no matter what size or scope it is. And so they look at a number of different categories. People always tend to think of energy efficiency as green, and it's true. Energy plays a huge component in your LEED rating system. It also looks at things like water efficiency, both inside your building and for your site. It looks at your location. Is it accessible by transit? Is it accessible by bike? Do you have alternative or electrical vehicle charging stations? How are you managing your site? Is there green space? Is there native vegetation? Are you able to manage stormwater on site?
Okay. So when you're describing the LEED sort of system and all of the inputs to determine that point-based rating, it sounds like potentially hundreds or even thousands of inputs, from the materials that your rugs are made out of to the dimensions of the building and how efficient that envelope is. How one would possibly organize all of this stuff is kind of mind-boggling. So you guys are positioning to solve that problem. So talk about what is the solution that Green Badger offers to address that.
Sure. So it tends to fall into two buckets. You have the whole upfront design side of things, which happens static, right, in the architect's and the engineer's office, and they put pen to paper, or now it's all obviously digitized, and they say, here's the footprint, here's what we want to do, and then that process stops. And then that gets handed over to the construction team, and then they are the ones responsible for implementation. Like, you can't just say you're doing these things. It's like filing your taxes. You've got to compile all of this information, submit it to the green IRS, if you will, which is the U.S. Green Building Council, and they're going to give a very rigorous overview, because this certification, again, it's mandated, it's in contracts, there's a lot of value behind it, and so then you've got to prove that you have done all of the green things you said you were going to do.
And so, do you submit your actual planning documents to the U.S. Green Buildings Council?
Yeah, so once you have your building designed, then you basically submit all of the design related things. So if you say, hey, we're going to have this much green space, you'll document that in the construction documents. And then as long as that doesn't change, you check the box and you get awarded those points. And then you go through, the challenge that we see is then you go through years of construction, and it's like everybody forgets what happened back then. And now it's only, well, what was going on site over the past 2 years? And you don't want to get to the end and find out, oops, we used the wrong product, or we didn't recycle enough waste. Mm-hmm. And now when we go to submit, the review says, nope, you didn't earn it, because now the building's built. You can't go back and take anything out of the landfill. So
hearing you describe all of that stuff, it's almost like an accounting system. I mean, you're tracking every single purchase and tying that to a plan effectively that's been approved.
Yeah, the analogy I use, it's right up that alley. I call us a TurboTax of LEED. Like, we are taking your 1040 and your W-2 and your receipts and your deductions, and we are tracking all of that and compiling all of that, and then so that we can present it in the format it needs to go to that certifying agency, well along the way providing transparency so that the team always knows, are we tracking how we should be tracking? Are we at risk of missing? Do we need to do a mid-course correction? Or what products should we don't know which ones to use. Well, we can suggest to you, and the system can provide you all of the information you need to find those products that comply and that have a lower environmental impact.
And who's buying your software? Who are your customers?
Predominantly, we work general contractors. So we're working with the actual builders, though we do work with a number of design teams who use this to help identify those products, and a number of consulting teams who are oftentimes just brought in to manage, because as you just described, it is complex. A lot of times teams will just bring in a complete third party. Back to your accounting, instead of using Concur or QuickBooks, they're bringing in an actual accountant. So sometimes teams do that on the LEED side of things as well, but they've still got to manage all of this, and they still find that same value in Green Badger.
So you alluded to the value of a LEED certification or a LEED rating, a commercial value. How is that value expressed in the market?
There's a number of ways. And so it depends where you are sort of in the market chain. So there's a lot of, sometimes it's just a requirement. So if you're building in the city of Boston, they have a requirement that anything you construct must be LEED certified or equivalent.
That's just the basic level, right?
I think it's LEED Silver. Silver there.
Okay.
But either way, they're basically saying, look, you've got to go above and beyond building code if you want to play ball. If you want to be in this city doing business, building buildings, you've got to do this. So you see some places it's just a market driver. Others, It's the value proposition, and it falls into a number of different areas. One is, if you're occupying the building or managing it, you will have lower utility rates, right? You're building this to be an energy efficient building, a water efficient building. That should translate into lower operating costs. Two, if you're leasing that space out, it just becomes more attractive. So you don't have vacancy as long.
A marketing tool.
Exactly. I mean, if you're frankly, there's plenty of people and they don't care about the sustainability of it and they want to use it for marketing. From my perspective, it's still a green building. Go for it. I don't care why you're doing it. Just do it because it's better than the alternative. And if you're leasing space, do you want to go in, again, a low performing, unhealthy space, or do you want to go into a green space?
If you were to characterize the building industry as a whole and kind of indicate, what percentage of developers are really leaning into green building practices and LEED certification versus folks who just don't see the value in that, or, how would you characterize the overall market right now?
Sure. It's grown to be about, by dollar value of like the total construction market in the US, to about 40%. So which is up from 20 in the 2000s. It got up to, about 30% in the 2010s, and now it's close to 40%. So you've seen it almost double in the last 20 years. So there's still a ways to go. You still have 60% of the projects that are, pull them out of a set of plans and they're code compliant, which is, not great, but it has made significant headways.
Do you happen to know, or is there any published information on, let's say, two buildings, like the use parameters of these buildings are equivalent, and let's say the footprint, physical footprint, square footage is roughly equivalent. Where they are in the world is the same. So sort of all else being equal, one is LEED certified, the other is just code compliant. Do you have a sense of the delta in cost, what it costs generally, all else being equal, to make a project LEED certified versus not?
Sure. So there's plenty of stats on that. I think if somebody said, give me a number, it's like less than 1%. And that's, again, if you're doing a platinum building, is it more? Probably, because you're putting renewables, you're doing things. To me, it comes back to trade-offs, right? When I built my house, it was LEED platinum certified. At the time, it was built for $130 a square foot, which was pretty inexpensive for the market. And it's okay, well, where do we trade off? And it was, well, we used really, cost-effective exterior finishes on the backs and sides where no one saw them. I didn't have to put brick and hardwood or, all over the place. It's like, we're going to really save money here, and we're going to spend it on things that matter to me, like a tight building envelope and a super efficient HVAC. So, if you just took a code compliant building and said, how do I slap LEED on it? Yeah, there's going to be a cost, because you're talking about doing the absolute bare minimum of a building. But it's not like you're saying, hey, if I'm driving a Toyota Prius and I want to drive a Tesla, those are two different things. You're not comparing them apples to apples.
Right. That makes sense. Where could sort of specific changes be made to most rapidly accelerate, low carbon, green building development?
Sure. So that could go a number of ways. I'll use one example. And again, I think the jury's still out on the reductions it's causing. But if you take New York City, they passed a law a couple of years ago that requires every building in the city to measure and disclose their carbon emissions from the building. And if it's over whatever they said is their baseline, you have to pay.
That's local law 97, I believe, right?
There you go. Local law 97. So what did that do? That forced every single building in the entire city of New York to audit their emissions. And then they've got to make that decision. Is it cheaper for me to pay the fine, or is it cheaper for me to decarbonize my building? And what our sense is that it becomes cheaper pretty quick to start decarbonizing your building. So call it a heavy-handed policy approach. But if you want to start getting everyone playing ball awfully quick, they were able to do that in a very, that didn't take 50 years of negotiation. That came together and is going to be impacting the buildings and reducing the carbon for the entire city, the largest city in the country, for a very long time.
Green Badger handles specific construction projects, individual homes, buildings, or complexes. But I mentioned earlier that entire cities can earn a LEED certification. There are more than 125 cities in the United States that are LEED certified, and more still in other countries. Chicago, Las Vegas, Dubai, and Surat, India are all LEED certified. But what exactly does that mean for a municipality? Neighborhoods, skyscrapers, parks, roads, sewers, and all to be officially green by any metric? And what are the reasons that cities might want to pursue LEED certifications in the first place? I had a chance to discuss it with Hilari Varnadore, Vice President for Cities at the U.S. Green Building Council. She helps manage the LEED for Cities and Communities program, for which USGBC partnered with a number of civil society organizations, including the National League of Cities and ICLEI USA. Hilari said their first step was to figure out what they meant by the word sustainability in the first place.
There truly was a time when we were sitting around a table saying, what is sustainability? What do we mean by that, right? How do we measure it? What's included, what's not included? But that is absolutely where we were in 2008, 2009, when this program was beginning.
So the body of these, diverse perspectives came together and kind of formed a definition of what sustainable cities means. So what does it mean?
So our rating system has a variety of categories. They're touching on things like natural systems, water, waste, we call it materials and resources. There's a transportation and land use category. There's an energy and emissions category. There's quality of life, where we touch on education, the economy, all the social equity issues, health and safety are in there. And then we have a couple of other like special categories that aren't so focused on content areas, but we have an integrative process category, which is about getting your team organized. So that's this big scorecard of topics, but we also weave equity throughout the rating system. We do a number of things like we don't just ask how much acreage of green space do you have, but we want to know, do people have equitable access to the green space?
Right. And how long does it take from a city approaching U.S. Green Building Council with the desire to become LEED City certified to actually either obtaining the certification or not obtaining a certification?
Everybody that's started has been able to certify. We haven't had to turn anyone away yet, which is good. But in terms of timeline, there's certainly places that have been done in around 6 to 9 months, but some places get a little off track, particularly if, the federal government comes up with this amazing legislation with grants and funding and your mayor asks you to start working on that at the same time.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's happening right now. There's the capacity of local governments to get this work done is certainly impacted by all the other things, all the attention, when they have to shift attention to other things. So it's a busy time right now in the US market, at least, with all of the federal money.
I'm sure. When I think of sustainability, I think about like recycling and I think about emissions. I think about green energy, which I understand are factors within LEED, but it's much bigger than that ultimately. So I guess what are the more highly weighted components of the system?
So there's a document, the Foundations of LEED, that establishes that criteria and in LEED's impact category specifically. But currently, the energy and emissions category is the highest rated, in terms of point value in the rating system. And that goes back to the impact categories and the Foundations of LEED, that we're all a part of.
Right. Makes sense. So from what you've described, I guess I'm thinking about what is the value to cities to obtaining a certification. And I think you've described a couple of points of value. Number one, the certification framework kind of gives a city a management framework. Like it's like, these are the points that are important in this framework. So let's adopt them as sort of goals for our city.
Exactly.
And so that makes a lot of sense. So what are some of the other reasons that becoming LEED certified as a city is valuable for the city? Why should they spend the resources? If you're pitching it, why should a city that with all these other priorities, things they need to do, why should they go to the trouble of becoming LEED certified?
It's a good question. And we work with anybody and everybody. So very small places, very large cities, counties as well. So they're obviously coming at it for different reasons, right? Just based on where they are and, how long they've been doing this work. So just a couple examples to make sense of that. So like Santa Monica, California, they've been really reporting on sustainability data metrics 25, 30 years, right? They didn't need us to tell them today, at least, what sustainability is. However, it's really important for them to show that like all the actions that they've been taking, all the investment that they've made, that it truly is getting them to sustainable outcomes. They're getting the community conditions, that they were aiming to meet. But then for the place that's really just getting started, many cities that we've worked with, Tampa was a great example. They'd hired a chief resilience officer. The guy, Whit Raymer, like first day on the job, he shows up and there's this thing on his desk. It says, "You're going to get us certified in LEED for cities." And he's like, okay. In his case, it was a great opportunity to, as a new CRO, meet all of the people across not just the city government, but all the other entities that are tied into these categories.
But for something like that, for the Tampa example, why did his boss, whoever put that document on his desk, why did that person want Tampa to be LEED certified?
So in the case of Florida, we do have quite the activity going in the state of Florida. Climate change is at everyone's front door, but it's very obvious the work that they need to be doing at the local level. And so there were some large counties that have been working on this stuff with us, places that really got going early, and then they supported the municipalities within their boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
So, the competition and the, hey, everybody's doing it, that's really spread across Florida and has come up the coast.
So what you're describing is just basically like social pressure and sort of a status, symbol that it's come to represent.
Well, and not just that too. I mean, I think there's a recognition that accreditation is important in this space, right? That like we do third-party verification. And so this isn't just self-reported. It's not disclosure. I mean,
I was going to ask you about that.
They're specifically achieving rigorous standards and rigorous thresholds that are then vetted and reviewed by a third-party verification team. So this is, much like a public health department gets accredited, we're accrediting their sustainability program. And
Right.
so that is, that's a level of sophistication that certainly like the city, county manager, or the mayor's office, they're looking for, right? Besides just an accolade, it's a true like this is an accomplishment, and it's something that we can like work off of and improve over time.
So essentially, it really is. It's something that, as LEED for Cities becomes more widely known, there's also sort of a bottom-up effect, or people are demanding that of their cities, and that's where there's interest in doing this. Very interesting. So you mentioned a moment ago that the data is verified, and I would imagine that could get kind of expensive for a city if you're reviewing all of this data, and you have to presumably hire auditors of some sort to review and audit all this, or how does that piece work?
Well, so we have a certification review team. The review team, reviews all the applications. Everybody gets an initial or like a preliminary review. They get a report back that's like, you're good to go here. These are areas you need to fix. And then they get final review. But so it's on our side, right? It's on our side. On theirs, they need a person at the city to like physically go get the data and then report it. And that is the time consuming part of this, right?
Yeah.
Some of this is, it's just a matter of like getting it on paper. And, I was talking about a chief resilience officer earlier. You can imagine that individual has a lot going on. And so to really like sit and focus and write out the narratives and get the data reports done, it can be tough.
Yeah, I can imagine that makes sense. What have you seen as some of the most encouraging or exciting, sort of fulfilling even consequences of this LEED for Cities system? Does it cause any, does it sort of, have you noticed change in cities as a result of this process, and what can that look like? If any specific examples that come to mind?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's like millions. Just a huge one was Las Vegas a couple of years ago got certified, and Marco Vallada is a planner for the city, and he was managing LEED for City certification alongside the Las Vegas 2050 master plan process. No small job there. Well, he was able to advance the 2050 master plan completely consistent with LEED for Cities, so that as they're working on plan implementation, they're also advancing these broader outcomes, these sustainability and resilience outcomes from LEED for Cities, so that they can be improving their certification as they're making just improvements on the ground all across Las Vegas.
Cool. So last question for you. I'm a mayor, let's say. I've never heard of LEED for Cities, and I have no idea if this actually happens, and maybe it doesn't, but let's say that I'm a sort of a skeptical mayor, and I say, well, my residents only care about jobs and crime or something. My hands are full.
Yeah. Hey, well, if they want jobs, I would say, well, Denver got Panasonic thanks to LEED for Cities. And Arlington and Washington, D.C., they sure did use LEED for Cities in their bid for Amazon. And where did it go? So branding your city as a sustainable city, a place that has high quality of life, that values, like you said, this is just a good city, right? Well, do we want this to be a good city? And not just a good city for some people, but for everybody, right? We need to really uncover those areas that have had disinvestment or haven't had the same level of service or assets.
Have you guys studied at all the connection between economic growth or job growth or any of these sort of basic indicators and LEED certification?
That's a great question. We do have a brand new innovation and research team that's expanding here in our organization to really do that. And we are actually this year really intentionally starting to pull more of the stories, the threads across all of the cities and counties that we work with together, because we have more than 125 places that are certified, many of which have recertified over the years as we evolve the rating system. We're working with about 200 across the world. They have a lot to offer each other and then to inspire others to come along. I mean, I know LEED for Cities, it does take time. You have to have somebody to like physically go through it. I've been working on this program for a long time now, and I haven't figured out like a way to just like snap your fingers and you have the results. But the work is what's transformative. Like it is the process that brings people together, that gets you talking, helps you institutionalize sustainability in your city or in your county.
Yeah. Hilari, thanks again for talking to me about LEED for Cities. This was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really great talking with you.
That's it for this episode of the Climate Now podcast. To learn more about green infrastructure and urban policy, check out our other podcast conversations at climatenow.com. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, please email us at contact@climatenow.com or tweet us at @WeAreClimateNow. We hope you'll join us for our next conversation. Climate Now is made possible in part by our science partners like the Livermore Lab Foundation. The Livermore Lab Foundation supports climate research and carbon cleanup initiatives at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which is a Department of Energy applied science and research facility. More information on the Foundation's climate work can be found at livermorelabfoundation.org.